This one for me has been a long time coming. Just the other day in Australia, we finally got the Netflix release of Wallace and Gromit Vengeance Most Foul, after it debuted in the UK on Christmas Day. It also did have a limited theatrical release before Christmas, and I did think about actually going to see it, but I figured in the end, since it would eventually be coming to streaming, it would be a bit silly to waste my money like that. Regardless though, from the get-go, I was very hyped for the movie. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been a massive fan of Aardman Animation and just claymation in general. I remember when I was a little kid being so sad that it felt like it was a bit of a dying art. In the same way I'm sort of sad these days that traditional 2D animation is far less popular. I was too young to actually see the original releases of the OG Wallace and Gromit short film trilogy, but throughout the late 90s to early 2000s, it did feel like they got played on TV quite a lot, so I ended up really loving them too. Then there was stuff like Creature Comforts, especially the show. I loved Chicken Run, not so much the second one, but the first one was an absolute masterpiece. Then we come to what has got to be the GOAT Aardman work, Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit. This film solidified my love of the franchise forever. I truly think it's one of the best animated films ever made, with an all-timer cast, a top-tier script, and so much creativity on display. For years afterwards, I was holding out hope that Aardman would make another film. Matter of Loaf and Death came out, but that was a short film, not a full feature-length one. I needed more. Then Aardman made a bunch of other movies, and whilst I'm sure they're great and all, I well and truly fell off the wagon in those years and moved on to other things. I figured this era was over, and they didn't want to return to the old classics. They wanted to do their own thing, work on fresh projects, and not be weighed down by nostalgia. I get it. Happily though, it seems like 20 years was enough of a break for a couple of their classic franchises. First we got Chicken Run, Dawn of the Nugget, which I'll be honest, I did not really like. Before this year, or last year I suppose now, but this year for me, we got Wallace and Gromit Vengeance Most Foul, which serves as a sequel to what is in my opinion the best of the original Wallace and Gromit shorts, The Wrong Trousers, and whose trailer promised the return of the classic villain, Feathers McGraw. So to say I was hyped up for this movie would be a massive understatement, and I think many people agreed with my assessment and found themselves on the bandwagon. It ended up doing some pretty massive numbers overall, bringing in over 9 million viewers for its broadcast on BBC One. Not too shabby numbers if you ask me, and way above what most shows or films get these days. On top of that, it seems to have been universally well received with a 100% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Fair enough, I suppose. This would imply that the film is genuinely very, very good. But for me, I walked away from it feeling a bit meh. It wasn't bad, don't get me wrong, and I guess I enjoyed it, but I just didn't have the same feeling at all that I did when I watched all of the others. I kept waiting for the moment that it would kick into high gear for me and turn into another classic, and yet that moment never really came. I sat there when it ended and thought to myself, is that it? I don't know, I'm just not all that enthused by it. It's not in a way of me hating the film either, it's just sort of apathy at this point. It wasn't very memorable. So I suppose we should puzzle out why I felt that way. When we're talking about an animated film, you can largely group things together into three broad categories. There's the visuals, the audio, and the narrative elements. Suppose we'd better briefly touch on those first two categories, right? As per usual, the animation was superb. Claymation is such an awesome art form and is not something you see enough of in this day and age. This, of course, is the gold standard, as all Aardman films tend to be. Gorgeous in every respect, fluid and colourful and exciting. Loved the world design, the griminess of the zoo, the clutter of Wallace and Gromit's house, to the colourful countryside and rivers, just excellent all around. I do remember there was a bit of fear surrounding this film recently, right? I think the factory that made the type of clay they used for filmmaking closed down, and so Aardman had to buy out the remaining stock, which was used for this film. So does that mean that any film made with a new supplier is going to look slightly different? Obviously it would still have that classic Aardman style with the faces, the shapes and whatnot, but I guess I'm talking in general terms. Will it affect the visuals all that much? Hope not, otherwise this film really is the end of an era. Although if it was the end, visually speaking, this is a great way to go out. Then we come to the audio side of things. As per usual, the music was incredible and nostalgic and wonderful. Just a magical thing that transported me back to being a kid again. On top of that, great voice acting. The new voice for Wallace is a dead ringer for the old one. I'm sure a superfan or something would be able to easily tell the difference between the performances, but I wasn't able to. I think this might have even been his first real big appearance as Wallace as well. The OG was still doing the voice for A Matter of Loaf and Death, and this guy only took over for adverts and stuff, I'm pretty sure. Like I said though, it feels like he very much replicates the magic of the voice, and that's all you need. On top of that, the rest of the voice cast was really good too. Loved the return of the police chief, who was a classic in the Were-Rabbit film, and a classic in this one too. And the newer characters, Norbot and Mukherjee, were great additions as well that brought in a lot of light and levity to the film. So in those first two categories, we're doing well. It's an all-timer of a movie thus far, and you love to see it. If either of these two categories were done badly, you could kiss the success of this film goodbye. When so much nostalgia is riding on it, people are going to be far more hypercritical of something fresh, and so if it doesn't look perfect or has spotty performances or music, it's game over. This wasn't the case though, they hit it out of the park in both respects. That being said though, if it doesn't have a good narrative, what's the point of all of that? I suppose we'd better recap this thing then. As we said earlier, Wallace and Gromit Vengeance Most Foul picks up many years after The Wrong Trousers. Not much seems to have changed for our dynamic duo. Wallace continues to think he knows best no matter what and often ignores Gromit, whilst also becoming more and more dependent on gadgets and technology to the point that he no longer knows how to function without it. Meanwhile, the villain of The Wrong Trousers, Feathers McGraw, has found himself in the midst of life imprisonment in the local zoo. What were his crimes again? Didn't he only steal a diamond? Life in prison for that? Whew, seems a bit much. Wallace, facing a lot of bills as a result of spending so much money for inventing parts, finds himself in need of some urgent dough. And so he casually just manages to whip up a pretty much sentient robotic garden gnome that he dubs Norbot. Norbot is an overnight sensation and becomes famous in their region, which catches the attention of McGraw in prison. Annoyed by Norbot's loud charging, Gromit takes him into the basement and plugs him into the computer, which gives McGraw the chance to remotely hack into the gnome using the zoo computer. This allows him to turn Norbot evil, as for some reason, Wallace gave him an evil setting when designing him. Norbot then builds an army of other Norbots, all also evil, and working for McGraw. Although Wallace is pleased at the time, it's very clear that these guys are bad news, and they rob all of Wallace's clients, which puts the police onto Wallace's trail, leading to them confiscating all of his inventions and technology, except for the gnomes, who seemingly vanish. It turns out that all along the gnomes were building a big submarine with which they could use to bust Feathers out of prison, which Gromit discovers, prompting an assassination attempt by Feathers, with Norbot Prime cutting the branch of a tree that Gromit's hiding in, causing them both to fall into a lion cage at the zoo. The fall resets Norbot to his regular setting, and the two manage to escape the lion and make their way back home to warn Wallace. As it's at this point that it's revealed that the blue diamond Feathers stole in The Wrong Trousers was never put back into the vault at the bank. He managed to switch it with a turnip and stash the diamond in an old teapot at Wallace and Gromit's house. Since they always use gadgets to make tea, they never touched their old pot, and the diamond sat there forgotten for years. Feathers ties them up, and he attempts to make his escape by narrowboat along the canals, with Wallace, Gromit and Norbot following along on their own narrowboat stolen from Chief Inspector McIntosh. The police follow along riding a bicycle, with a low-speed chase eventually leading to an aqueduct. McGraw begins to steer his narrowboat off the aqueduct after Gromit jumps aboard, which leaves Gromit teetering and prompts him to give up the diamond to McGraw at Wallace's urging. To escape, Feathers uses an umbrella to parachute down onto a train heading to Yorkshire, whilst the Norbot squad save Gromit from a fiery death. In the end, whilst Feathers escapes to Yorkshire a free penguin, he doesn't get his hands on the diamond, and so the story is really set up with a sequel in mind. So as I said earlier, I walked away from this movie with a definitive feeling of, okay. For the life of me though, I'm struggling to articulate why it is I feel this way. Why do I feel a bit whelmed by the whole thing? But the more I think about it, the more I'm coming around to the idea that maybe the film was just too long for the content they had. I get that they wanted to be ambitious with it and make it a full-length feature film. That does make a lot of sense. And it obviously has paid off. The ratings and reviews prove that. But I look at this and then I look at something like Curse of the Were-Rabbit, and I can't help but think that Were-Rabbit has a lot more substance the whole way through. It was more jam-packed with action and jokes and story. Here, it felt like they had a certain plot laid out with certain jokes that would have made for a perfect 40-minute special, maybe? But then they had to find an additional 40 or so minutes of runtime, and instead of infusing it with even more content, it's like they spaced out what they had instead, which I think hurt my enjoyment of things a touch. Never enough to make me dislike the movie, but enough for it to be noticeable both at the end of the film looking back on it, but even whilst I was sitting there watching, which was a shame. In the end, I think it was a triumphant return for an all-time great franchise. I just wish it could have been a bit more interesting the whole way through. And so, with all that being said, these have all just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of Wallace and Gromit Vengeance Most Foul? Did you like it? Maybe not? Do you have anything to add? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.